Okay, so to answer the question, how are right whales using their space differently? We broke the region up into polygons that make sense if you're a right whale. So these aren't going to make sense to you. Obviously, if you're a statistician, you're going to feel a little bit queasy because they're all very different sizes. So that can be an issue if you don't keep that in mind when you're doing your modeling. But there are some key areas if you're a right whale. They love springtime feeding in Cape Cod Bay. They used to always feed in the Bay of Fundy in the summer. They like to feed here in Roseway Basin, and then they newly would come around the Scotian Shelf and pop into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. We don't have, I think I'm one farther than I think I want to be. We don't have any polygons in this case for this paper in the Mid-Atlantic Bight because our observation efforts are so low. We can't say much about how they're using it. But we did throw a polygon here for their calving ground, right? This is Florida here in Georgia and South Carolina. I highlight this box. It says MIX, the Mingan Island Cetacean Survey. It's this group of people that go out on boats all spring, summer, and fall and look for blue whales up here by Mingan Island. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because when we're looking for right whales and taking a picture of those callosities and identifying which whale it is, we've been doing that here. We had not been doing that in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So to answer the question, how were right whales using the Gulf of St. Lawrence before 2017, when there was that big mortality event? That was a pretty tricky thing to answer because we didn't have effort there. So I threw this in as sort of a nice aside. The Mingan Island Cetacean Survey, it doesn't really occur where the right whales are. The right whales would hang out in the Gulf of St. Lawrence around here, Shadiac Valley and Bredell Valley. So it was too far north, but they had tons of survey effort over a time period, and they saw a couple of right whales in the late 90s when the prey collapsed. That's kind of interesting. And then starting in, I think, 2014, the Mingan Island Cetacean Survey started seeing right whales in their neck of the woods. Okay, so this is just a little independent survey to say it does actually seem like right whales were not using the Gulf of St. Lawrence prior to this unusual mortality event, or at least not much prior, maybe a year or two before. Otherwise, we relied on all the vessels and airplanes that are going out looking for right whales all the time, sponsored by NOAA, New England Aquarium, all kinds of groups. And the underlying data set is beautiful, and we turn it into a metric called sightings per unit effort. So if you're into fisheries, you're probably pretty acquainted with catch per unit effort. Like how many tuna did you catch based on how many hooks you threw in the water? You need that how many hooks if you're going to get some kind of robust biological metric. So our metric was something like how many track lines, how many kilometers of track line by an airplane or a vessel, and then how many right whales did they see under that track line. And we examined that for each of these polygons and took those numbers and aggregated them together. And so here, this is sort of a raw data figure, and I'm showing it for an interesting time period, Q2, which is April, May, and June, across the whole decade of the 2000s and the whole decade of the 2010s. And the most significant thing that you'll see is in the 2000s, those whales were starting to enter the Bay of Fundy, probably towards the end of Q2 for feeding. In the 2010s, that number of whales declined, but whales were showing up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Okay, so there's probably a displacement of whales from there to there. There's also some interesting things happening down here. They're using this area, Cape Cod Bay, more in the 2010s. And then if you're into offshore wind, which a lot of people are, especially in the New Jersey, Rhode Island area, what's going on in this box is really important to you because this is where the currently being constructed wind energy lease site is. And so in the 2000s, when they were worried about right whale protection and conservation planning around the implementation of these turbines, the whales weren't there. So it was kind of not a big deal. But then in the 2010s, the right whales started to show up. Just as plans were starting to get put in place to build these turbines, that's when the right whales came. So this is a big management issue. But I took maps like these, many maps like these, and I put them together in a big confusing heat map, just like Andy does. And this is the month of the year, right? So January, February, March. And this is the polygon of interest. And the polygons are still here. So you see GSL is the Gulf of St. Lawrence. BOF is the Bay of Fundy. And they're pretty much situated from north to south. So that can kind of give you a little bit of an easy feeling. SEUS is the Southeast US. I didn't even put it on that map, but it's that thin calving habitat off the coast of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. So the color of these boxes is, did the sightings of right whales per unit effort get bigger in the 2010s compared to the 2000s or smaller? So the blue numbers are when there were more right whales there in the 2000s. And the red numbers is when there were more right whales there in the 2010s. That's what this 2000s minus 2010s thing is supposed to indicate to you. And so you see once again that major pattern. Right whales were using the Bay of Fundy more in the 2000s, and then they were using Cape Cod Bay and Massachusetts Bay more in the 2010s. They were also using it for a longer period of time. If you are a right whale biologist, or if you're working for NOAA and trying to design conservation policy, all of these boxes matter. Right? Because you're trying to figure out for this area how a right whale is using it differently. So this kind of analysis is really important for guiding management, and this is a heavily managed species. But as oceanographers, we were really interested in what's causing the changes that we're seeing. And the CPR is great, right? It goes from here to here, but we definitely don't have CPR samples in all of those polygons, because the CPR doesn't go down here, it doesn't go up here, it certainly doesn't go. There are other CPR tracks, but not that have the spatial resolution that we were looking for. So we switched over to use the EcoMon program. It's a net towing program sponsored by NOAA. The tricky thing about the EcoMon program, there's tricky things about the CPR that we didn't get into. But the way these net tows work is they're oblique tows. They go from the seafloor and up to the surface and collect all the bugs in one net. So you don't know anything about the depth distribution. They could have been evenly scattered throughout the water column, or they could have all been clumped into one spot. If you're a whale, you probably want them all to be clumped into one spot. You just want to swim once, open your mouth, gulp, and that's it. If they're diffusely scattered, it's really hard for you to get a good caloric bite, and it takes so much energy to forage. So we're missing out on that information, but the EcoMon has good spatial and temporal resolution. That's pretty much in the US EEZ, but we use some Canadian data too, which are marked by those red diamonds using the AZMP program. And it's the same idea. It's also these oblique net tows that are collecting all of the zooplankton in the entire water column and adding them together. And then we parsed things out. We looked at the, of course, late stage C. finmarchicus that we like so much. We added another bug, C. hyperboreus. Calanus hyperboreus is similar to Calanus finmarchicus. It hangs out closer to the pole than Calanus finmarchicus does, and it's bigger. Because it's bigger, we decided to throw in C4, the smaller stage. We didn't just say, like, what the hell, let's add C4. We took a cue card from the Canadians on that one. So the question is, what's happening with prey in the areas where right whale distribution is changing? And so I built the same kind of heat map, but this time this is with the zooplankton data. In this case, it's all using the EcoMon program, so all the net tows collected in the US. And the key thing that I want to point out is in the 2010s, when right whales were using the Cape Cod Bay and Massachusetts Bay more, and they were using it for a longer part, they were using it starting in the end of winter and then all the way through to the end of spring, even into the start of summer, which was unusual for right whales who'd usually peace out and head up to the Bay of Fundy. During that period, the EcoMon finds that there was an increase, redder numbers, of C. finmarchicus in the 2010s. So the red here in Q2, that's March, April, May, June, April, May, June, is Q2 for Cape Cod Bay, for Jeffrey's Ledge, for Massachusetts Bay, for the Gulf of Maine polygon, there was more bugs in the water in that Q2 at the same time period that right whale use of the habitat was increasing. So we're probably capturing actual real signals here. Similarly, we know that right whales seem to abandon the Bay of Fundy in the 2010s, and the data shows that there were less bugs in the Bay of Fundy in Q3 and Q4 in the 2010s. That's what the blue boxes show. More in the 2000s, less in the 2010s. So this matches up too. We also looked at that AZMP data, those 4 points in Canadian waters. The ones of interest are probably P5, that's in the Bay of Fundy, and Halifax 2, that's on the Scotian Shelf. But we're seeing blues there. Oh, Shadiac Valley, that's where the right whales are feeding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Okay, so we're seeing blues here. That means that the bugs went down in Canadian waters. The bugs went down in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. All right, so we may have been thinking, all right, prey collapsed in the Gulf of Maine or the Bay of Fundy, so the right whales shifted and ate somewhere else. But actually, Calanus declined in the Gulf of St. Lawrence too. It didn't decline as much, right? But it left this question, a question that people are still grappling with today. Is the Gulf of St. Lawrence an adequate replacement for the Bay of Fundy and Roseway Basin, these traditional feeding habitats in the summer and fall? And so I had an undergraduate, I was a brand new assistant professor, and an undergraduate came to me on day one, and she's like, I'm graduating this year and I want to do research with you before we leave. And so this is the research that she did. I said, well, Anna, we don't know if right whales are benefiting from this move to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And right now, I don't think that the zooplankton data are going to be able to answer the question. So she looked at the right whales, and there were 2 groups of right whales. There were those that went to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and there were those that went, we don't know where. So we call them the GSL, Gulf of St. Lawrence whales, and the non-GSL whales. And the fact that we don't know where about 60% of the whales are going in the summer sits very uncomfortably with NOAA, as you can imagine. It's a constant discussion point in every single meeting that we have. But she asked, out of the ones that are going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, oh, I should do this figure too. I love this figure. It takes too much time to explain, but it essentially shows that it's the same whales going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence year after year after year. Every one of these colored polygons is grabbing a number of whales that showed up that year. So you see, like the 2019 yellow year has a ton of overlap with the 2018 brown year. It's because the same individuals showing up every year. So it's about 40% are those Gulf of St. Lawrence whales, 60% are the others. And so I asked Anna, of the ones that we know are going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, how is reproduction going for them? Because at that point we had 4 or 5 years of data. And so we had 40, almost 50 potential mothers, almost 50 adult females that were using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and about 100 adult females that were not using the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Okay, but out of those groups, about half of the Gulf of St. Lawrence females had given birth since the shift in habitat, but only about a quarter of the non-Gulf of St. Lawrence females had given birth in that same time period. So it's, at this point, it's kind of back of the envelope, but it looks like the Gulf of St. Lawrence whales are doing better than the non-Gulf of St. Lawrence whales. So perhaps this habitat is supplying adequate prey. Because she was really interested in behavior, and nobody seems to think about right whales this way, we decided to tack a little more onto her analysis and ask the question, is there a family relationship between the animals that are using the Gulf of St. Lawrence? Like, if your mom uses the Gulf of St. Lawrence, are you more likely to use it? And that's exactly the question she asked. So if your mom uses the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that's this first bar, then the offspring, they might not be a calf anymore. They might have grown up to be an adult at this point. But that offspring is also more likely to use the Gulf of St. Lawrence. If your mom doesn't use the Gulf of St. Lawrence, then those offspring are less likely to use the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it's not 100%, but it's statistically significant. And then she broke it apart one more time to look at age. We think the young ones, of course, are going to follow their moms. At least for the first year, they have to nurse, right? So for the little ones, those that are less than 5 when we did the analysis, and we had 5 years of data since the for sure shift started. The little ones are very likely to follow mom. But even the older ones were statistically significantly more likely to follow mom into her habitat of choice. This is the first time anybody's tried to think, how do these whales relate to each other on an individual basis? Like they do that all the time with dolphins, these complex network and communication analyses. So it could be possible to dive deeper into those questions with this population. I'm going to show you this last figure from her paper. Why did we do this? It's illustrative of a few things, but partly at this point, we were just so deep in this sort of science communication and human management space, right? NOAA and other agencies and NGOs and the DFO were putting everything they could at solving this right whale crisis. And so I think graphics like these are helpful. But we took one famous mom, her number is 1140 and her name is Wart. And we looked at all of the babies that she's had and the babies that they've had. This is her whole family tree, starting with Wart. And just, I think there are a few interesting things that come out. The red whales are female and the bluish greenish whales are male. So Wart had plenty of female whales. And the female whales that she had were quite reproductively successful, just like she was. And there's other work saying that a reproductively successful mom is probably more likely to produce reproductively successful offspring. All right, so here this female then had 5 whales. The first 2 were female. Females are good for population growth, right? But one of them, she only had 1 female, and that female died just after birth. And the other one died just after birth. All right, so this whole part of the matriline became useless because of anthropogenic mortality. This is a very fecund family line, and they didn't have a chance to increase the population size. Same with this one. Her firstborn was a male, and then she got killed. This one's still doing well. She's still having offspring as far as this matriline was created. So anyways, you can see that story. We thought that was an important story to tell about how these matrilines grow or don't grow. And it's not so much reproduction, it's anthropogenic mortality that's stopping them. But also the boxes do tell you if they were Gulf of St. Lawrence whales or non-Gulf of St. Lawrence whales. And so you can see bits of things going on here. Wart died before anybody really headed up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So we don't know about the grandma. But one of her offspring, all of her children, all of her calves went to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it's family situations like that that drove that model and made that behavioral difference significant. Yeah.
How do you do such a family tree of ways? Like, how does it work?
I made this in PowerPoint by myself. I went onto the Right Whale catalog website and I looked up, and you can go on there right now and you could look up Wart. I thought through a few whales. There's not that many that have big family trees. So I essentially picked the one with the biggest family tree. And then I just went through the catalog and looked for all the offspring that she had, and then went through the catalog. And actually, I probably did this programmatically, and then did some checking in the catalog for these details. But yeah, all of this data is available and collated by the Right Whale Consortium. Every time they go out in an airplane or out on a boat looking for a whale, they take a picture of it, and based off of those white patches on its head, they say, oh, this one is number 1140, or this one is number 2645. And so they can build these family trees, especially when they see mom with a calf in the calving ground, then they can make that family association right at the start of the lifetime.
So that's one of the great things about studying the North Atlantic right whale is like every individual is known. And so it's kind of remarkable when you can sort of look at this hemispheric scale climate phenomena and then look at how individual whales and their lineage are responding to this change.
Mm-hmm.
Another question, have you looked at, because I'm just looking at numbers, it's just because I was looking at based off of colors. It looks like almost half of those that are males spent less time with both in the same region than it is for females. I think on the two of them decided not to stay in the same region. Then have you looked at that at all?
No. And we should. It was hard to do the analysis that we did. The sample size was on the edge of being too small, especially because following all these relationships, you lose a lot of data when you can't figure out what this offspring's mother was. And there were, you had to have only whales that were alive since 2015, since that shift seems to start. But yeah, I think that there's a lot more room to do research in this area. Not just the Gulf of St. Lawrence, non-Gulf of St. Lawrence question, but just generally, how are these guys relating to each other? Because it had just been assumed that after the 1-year-old weans, that's it. They all lead these very independent lifestyles, except for they'll come together to mate. And I don't think that's what it is. I don't think that's true. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so when colonists find actually going down in the Gulf of St. Lawrence,
yeah,
it's a management question of whether or not that's a suitable alternative. It's kind of an open question. I was wondering, those percent changes that he found with red versus blue, were those percent changes or numerical changes in numerical abundance?
Yeah, I think those were changes in numerical abundance, but the problem is you can't compare the AZMP data with the ECOMON data. And that's part of the reason I made it so complicated with all these different heat maps, because I did not want to make assumptions and lump things together. The sampling style is slightly different. The net sizes are slightly different. The frequency of sampling is way different. The ECOMON is scattered. Theirs is like a stratified random sampling system. And AZMP is a station. They always throw the net at the same spot. And then the other really big problem with comparing is we were only looking at Calanus finmarchicus in the ECOMON data, but we were looking at Calanus finmarchicus and Calanus hyperboreus in the AZMP data, because they have this whole other taxa that reasonably right whales can feed on. So we couldn't compare them, and so you can't compare them, but people are trying to compare them. And I think I'll talk about it a little bit right now. A little bit about the work that's being done.
Patchy, right?
They're super patchy. And so that's sort of what I was trying to describe with throwing the net in the water and it integrating the full water column. It's problematic because the degree of their patchiness is so important if you're a right whale. Less important if you're a cod, right? You can do more, swim here, take a little bite, swim there, take a little bite. But right whales, it takes so much energy to forage. It's like one dive, one mouth open, and if that's not successful, you've wasted energy, like critical energy.
A few decades ago, an oceanographer did a back of the envelope calculation, said if Calanus had this average abundance and it was homogeneously distributed, that the whales would have to swim at 6,000 miles an hour in order to get to meet its energetic demands.
Who did that?
I don't remember his name.
That sounds like a Mark thing.
Is there any really large scale, meaning the whole Gulf of Maine or the whole Gulf of St. Lawrence relationship between average over the whole Gulf and Gulf of like satellite chlorophyll and years of good Calanus to say that the Gulf of St. Lawrence was more productive relative to Gulf of Maine, broadly speaking?
Yeah, we don't think so. A lot of people have tried, and the only person that was successful was Dan Pendleton wrote a paper, like a pair of papers in 2009 and 2012, just focused on Cape Cod Bay. And when he was hyper localized, he could find an okay relationship. The problem is, and Chuck did some describing of the situation, is that Calanus is so tricky, right? They've got this very complex and long life cycle, but also advection is a big part of why they're there. It's not the local conditions. Like we think so many of those bugs in the Gulf of Maine are pushed in rather than created locally. So that's why phytoplankton has not been super useful. I want to say one other thing actually on the Neptos and Calanus. The highest density of Calanus that researchers have ever found is when they throw a net in front of a feeding right whale. So we, like when we're doing this sampling, the Ecomon surveys, the AZMP surveys, it's not realistic to what a right whale is seeing because the right whale is so much better at finding that dense patch. And we're just getting like a random spot in the ocean that's probably way less dense than what the right whales are feeding on. We talk about it all the time. No. No. The hot idea right now is DMS, the dimethyl sulfate. Have you heard about that? Yeah. And there's some efforts to measure it from space, like zooplankton burps. But I'm not a big fan of that method, but we'll save that for different. Do you have a question?
Yeah, it was about the right whale heat map on the same slide. Is that all individuals, male and female? And did you look at the pattern like individually by sex as well?
Like this one?
Yeah.
No. We did not look at it by sex. And that could be something you do. You know, your sample size is going to go down and everything, and then you've got a whole nother heat map to worry about your males versus females. But part of so these signals here in the Southeast US are statistically significant, but I made the scale for, whales per effort consistent across this whole heat map, sort of for obvious reason, but it makes the Southeast US look not interesting. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting. There's fewer right whales in the Southeast US in the 2010s because they weren't giving birth, so they didn't bother migrating. And that's an important and cool thing that doesn't get teased out because we didn't scale our color bar. And if we thought about just females, it probably would have come out. So it is important.
Oh, sorry. Do you know why in your original Leslie matrix model, the females have that higher mortality? And I noticed that it was like at all life stages, including the juvenile life stage. Do you have ideas why?
So that was in the marker capture model, and it's something we talk about a lot. And my grad student that is not here, I think she would say she maybe has the data to answer that. We're working on publishing it right now, but essentially ship strikes and fishing gear events are not consistent between males and females. The females seem to be at higher risk for all of these things. And you could speculate they're just covering more ground with their migration, or they're just spending more time close to shore, given where that migration takes place, that they're at higher risk. Another reason could be when they're with their calf, they stay in really shallow waters. So if you're a big boat barreling towards a whale, we think that the whale might try and dive to avoid it. But if you're in the Southeast US calving ground, there's nowhere to dive. But we're in the land of speculation, but really important speculation that we all need to be talking about if we're going to design a policy that's successful. Okay, upcoming research. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to try not to. I just wanted to show you the couple of things that we're working on now. These are not results oriented, but I think that you might find them interesting in general and as you think through your own projects. We're 1 year into an NSF project funded by the ORCC program, Organismal Response to Climate Change. And we're essentially asking, how are right whales adapting to climate change? And we have two hypotheses that we want to explore. One, that right whales are demonstrating climate resilience. One, they moved to a new spot to forage. That seems pretty resilient to me. Two, in that new spot, they're probably foraging on a new taxa. That seems pretty resilient to me. This is a picture of those taxa. This is Calanus finmarchicus. This is Calanus glacialis, polar and slightly subpolar copepod. And this is the big old Calanus hyperboreus. So it's a big bug with a big lipid sac that also goes into diatoms. So maybe this shift, and that's another thing, those heat maps from the AZMP, they were counts of bugs per, I think, meter squared of the net. It did not account for caloric value. The caloric value of hyperboreus is much higher than finmarchicus. So that's something that needs to be considered. So hypothesis 1, right whales are resilient. Hypothesis 2, there is some deficit. When climate change throws a challenge at you, it's going to take you a while to figure it out. This is a figure from a paper that Andy Pershing, you know that guy, published in the same journal as like a commentary to our regime shift paper that had the Gulf Stream shift north. And Andy and Dan Pendleton have this theory of this, I guess we'll call it a model or a schematic of what climate adaptation looks like. So these colors are a habitat quality and like the fitness of an animal in that habitat. So the idea is the habitat was good, and then climate change happened, and the animal is going to shift to a new habitat. And it might take time for that new habitat to be good. And that's expressed here in, let's see, D1 is the loss in fitness due to suboptimal environmental conditions. So it's this period. D2 is, even though the habitat is good, that's this dotted yellow line, the whale might not have found it. Okay, so that's the adaptation deficit. And the total deficit, the total cost of climate change to the animal is D1 plus D2. What was the deficit from the environment, and what was the deficit from your behavioral adaptation to the new environment? And so essentially what we're trying to do in this grant is quantify this for right whales. Abby showed this in her 3-minute lightning talk, but the way the grant looks is we're going to use a lot of Calanus data that we've already introduced to you guys. We're going to combine it with the movement model that Abby builds. We're going to try and figure out some feeding thresholds using Nick Record's Calanus patch model. We're going to try and better understand what makes a good patch. How dense does the Calanus have to be for a right whale to be there? And eventually we want to build a species distribution model. Where are right whales going based off of when the prey is dense enough for them to forage there? And I'm just going to talk about it for a minute. The early parts of the project, because we've only been in it for a year. But this is a figure similar to what Abby showed you yesterday. This is a tagged whale. So that's a really rich data set compared to what we do when we just see them with an airplane or a vessel. But Abby is building a model to estimate where the animal is between observations. The reason we want to do that is because we want to demonstrate the use of under-observed habitats. The mid-Atlantic, we know the whales are going there because they show up in the Southeast US every year, but we don't know where they're using that space. Even being able to estimate it with a model will give management some tools. The same problem exists off the Scotian Shelf and in through the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. We also want to be able to characterize an individual whale's exposure to prey throughout as much of its year as we can. And so this gives us that chance to say, oh, well, it fed here for a month and it fed there for a couple of weeks. And maybe we can do a better job of assessing the cumulative prey that a single individual is exposed to, that ingests and gets to build their blubber layer. I'm not going to talk more about it. One of the things we're doing in this project is we're looking at right whale poop. We've collected, not we, but a whole host of scientists that have been working for decades have collected poop from all kinds of right whale habitats. And we're taking small pieces of it and trying to figure, can we tell what bug was in that piece of poop? So we're looking, of course, for Calanus finmarchicus. We're looking for Calanus hyperboreus. That's going to be definite evidence of climate resilience. See, they're using a new taxa. But we also want to better understand those small copepods that Andy was talking about. We know right whales are eating centropods and pseudocalanus. but where and in what quantities. And that's going to help us better understand how to apply that movement model to a patch model in a way that we can understand how the whale is getting exposed to its prey. This is what a patch model might look like. This was built by Camille Ross in Nick Ruckard's lab. So we're using environmental variables. It could include marine heat waves to say, is there a dense enough patch of zooplankton for right whales to feed on? But one part of that question is what does make a dense enough patch? And Camille, just looking through the literature, found a wide range of answers to that question. So that's a tricky part for us. That patch model, the reason it is, one of the reasons it's very exciting is it can be used to forward project Calanus or other zooplankton into the future. And you could just ask the question like Ray Gondot did, you know, how will Calanus change? But in this case, Nick and his lab are asking, how is right whale foraging space changing? So here's an example of one of his forward projections. This one's under RCP 8.5. That's a very intense scenario. In the year 2075, red is places where right whale foraging habitat is reduced, and yellow, it's the same, and blue is places where right whale foraging habitat increases. So in general, you see a lot of red here. This model isn't really ready to go, but these are the kinds of things that we'd like to do with it. There's other components, like right here, I put this ominous text box about the SDM, the species distribution model. At this point, like that is so nascent that we're not even going to talk about it. But eventually we want to put it all together into something. And it's the kind of model that we hope that, never mind, that's more detail than you need. Okay, here's the other project. So the first project I just showed you is funded and we're just getting started with it. This is a project I just submitted to NSF, so it might not be funded, but I think it's super cool. Here's a figure that actually was on Lydia's lightning presentation. This is a paper that she published looking at marine heat wave events in the Gulf of Maine in these 4 marine heat wave active years. And the paper tries to go into some detail about why those heat waves are different and sort of the different origin stories of these events. So my question is, are marine heat waves impacting the copepods that right whales forage on? And I'm going to talk about that here. So glad that Andy ran through this. I absolutely adore this paper of his because it sets up work that I want to do. But you know, he told the story of breaking the bugs into the big ones, the Calanus and the Keatingnaps, and the small ones, right? The Centrophages, the Pseudocalanus, the Metridia. And so he's got these 2 PCs and he shows that they don't vary together, right? Sometimes the situation is dominated by the small copepods and sometimes it's dominated by Calanus. And the story he tells is about stratification. And it's still, as he said, in hypothesis land. But the idea is in the spring, when we know Calanus is doing well, or in the 2000s, when right whales were producing like gangbusters, or in the 1980s, in this set of conditions that were cold or salty, the Calanus did really well. They ate down on the smaller bugs. There wasn't much food for the predators, so he has some sort of ecological relationship here. But the main thesis of his paper was that this bottom-up component, that these hydrographic data are showing that the Calanus like well-mixed water. And then in the summer, when stratification happens, the Calanus don't do so well. It shifts into a community that's dominated by these smaller copepods. Why am I bringing this up? Good question. Because his theory is all about stratification. And marine heat waves could be interacting with stratification. And I feel like I wrote it down. In 2 ways. A marine heat wave that's coming in the spring could initiate stratification, right? It could turn the region into summer-like conditions earlier than it would have otherwise, right? It could also augment, right? Strengthen stratification. On the other side, already stratified waters could prime the area for marine heat waves, right? You've got that nice surface heat content that gives you an environment that could be more prone, or as Chuck used, conditioned for a heat wave. So here's a paper that I read by Salih et al., just published a couple of years ago. And he's essentially saying that heat wave, that stratification is strengthening. And the interesting outcome of this paper was stratification was occurring at depth more than was expected. This is using models and in situ data. And then this is another paper published by Lee et al. In 2020, and it's showing a potential density trend. This is data collected, I can't remember over what period of time, but it's saying the red is an increase in stratification or a decrease in density. And he did this across all three major ocean basins, like the Indian, the Pacific, and the Atlantic. And the trends looked about the same, that in the top 400 meters of the water column, you were seeing an increase in stratification or a decrease in density. So the seas might be preconditioned for these marine heat wave events. Another thing that we're interested in exploring in this NSF grant, in addition to marine heat waves and stratification, are warm core rings, including how do warm core rings interact with marine heat waves. And this is a cool paper by Glenn Gorkowitz, where there was this intense warm core ring formed in November 2016 off of New Jersey, and he thinks it triggered this marine heat wave that was really poorly observed from space because it happened in the winter and there were lots of clouds. But he used several local data sets to follow the trajectory of this marine heat wave as it seems to advect down across the mid-Atlantic bight. So that's another question is, especially in this area, when we've got this Gulf Stream breaking away at Cape Hatteras and shedding all these warm core rings into our area, how are those interacting with marine heat waves? Are they creating them? Are they strengthening them? And what does that mean for the bugs? Okay. Like I said, I could talk for too long. Andy went through this. I just wanted to throw it up again to say, here is evidence that, marine heat waves are happening, sea surface temperature is rising in the Gulf of Maine, and it has economic consequences, right? He described the increase in lobster landings, and when your factory isn't set up to process all that lobster, it goes to waste, and the fishery loses money. And I wanted to use that as a segue back into right whales. So the lobster fishery came up with a plan to deal with this environmental catastrophe because in 2016, they had set up more canning factories, essentially, and they could process quickly all this lobster and then save it for later, and then the cost of lobster didn't drop in that second marine heat wave year. So what can we do, us right whale biologists or managers at NOAA? And here's an example of something that we're trying to do in the lab. Here's Abby right there on the cover of the Post and Courier throwing this yellow robot off the side of the boat that is going to listen for right whales. So as we understand, the problem is that right whales are changing their distribution, right? We can protect a space, sort of, a little bit, if we know that the right whale is going to be there. But if we don't know, that puts us in this really sticky situation. They're getting hit by boats. These are propeller scars. They're getting tangled up in fishing gear. This is seasonal management areas. There are places where we think right whales are going to be in a given season, and we ask vessels to slow down for that season. This is a static management schedule that NOAA instituted a long time ago. But because right whale distributions are changing, we've increased dynamic management. That says there isn't usually a plan to slow boats down in this area, but we saw a right whale. So let's slow boats down in this sort of 40-mile by 40-mile box for 3 weeks. So that's dynamic management. Dynamic management relies on observation. If you don't have eyes or ears on the water, then it's useless because you're not going to see the right whale that wasn't supposed to be there. So we're trying to put some ears in the water in the Southeast US. Here is some websites you can go to see where whales are in real time. And this snapshot I don't remember what date I took this, but here are places where there are buoys listening for whales. Our lab analyzes this green buoy, that's the Norfolk buoy, and so data is getting sent around the clock, 24/7, even on Christmas morning, showing what that buoy heard. And then Abby or maybe Lydia soon or me are checking the computer and saying that was not a right whale, guys, or that was a right whale, so let's initiate some dynamic management. That's happening here too, off the coast of Savannah. There's another buoy. This buoy has been really non-functional. We think people are hitting it with their boats or dragging it away. I don't know if it's malicious, but it keeps, every time we put it out there and right whale season comes up, it gets destroyed. This is us trying to put one of these robots in the water. They're both doing the same thing. They're listening for whales and sending us this data back in real time. The reason it's so important, there's already a requirement for vessels to slow down, but they don't. And we're hoping that if we have live, real-time information to say, yes, generally you're supposed to slow down, but really we heard a right whale here yesterday or an hour ago, it would be really great if you would slow down. So that's sort of the motivator for putting dynamic management in place here. This is just a map that's essentially saying boats are supposed to slow down. So there are mechanisms to get right whale alerts sent to your cell phone. We're working on mechanisms to get alerts sent right to the nav system on people's boats in the Southeast US. This is the kind of data that we analyze. These are nice right whale upcalls. This is a fin whale hanging out in the background, and this is junk. So we're always looking at things and saying, oh, right whale, or no, that's junk. And I think I'm done. I'll give one more slide. No, I'll give two more slides. So here is, we've tried this glider, this yellow robot off the coast of the Southeast US. It's really exciting. It's also really challenging because this is a super shallow habitat right on the shelf off the Southeast US. Those gliders want to dive in really deep water. So we're trying to figure it out. But this January, not this January, that was last January, which was a big fat nothing burger, mostly because the glider broke. But this January, for the first time, we heard a confirmed right whale detection with our glider off the Southeast US. So proving that the system works, now we just got to get the system to work better. So it's exciting. This isn't, at this point, I mean, we can do some acoustics with it to understand propagation and some like, how effective will these systems be in the Southeast US? They're going to be less effective because the propagation environment is not as good for acoustics, mostly because it's shallower. There's also a lot of tidal energy mixing up the water. But there's a little science we can do here, but this is mostly like our bleeding hearts just trying to manage the species. And then the last thing I promised that I want to say, I already mentioned a bit that offshore wind and right whales are interacting, especially just below Cape Cod Bay in the southern New England area where they're putting up those first large-scale wind farm sites. And one of the things, I worked with the National Academy of Sciences to write a big report about what is a turbine going to do to the movement of water that could affect right whale foraging. And it was a crazy question. And we told them that from the start, that nobody has the data to answer that. But the truth is, it could do a lot of things. These bugs are very sensitive. This is a sweet figure that I took from a paper published a decade ago that shows the different spatial scales of events that impact these bugs, right? Microturbulence impacts their feeding rate, and meridional overturning impacts their advection into these habitats. And there's stuff along the entire scale. So we wrote this report, but I just bring it up because this is a big open question, right? These kinds of questions, we're also changing the infrastructure to the ocean, and we don't know how that's going to impact the physical environment and the biological environment that depends on that physical environment. The last, yeah, I said it was the last slide. This is, I'll say I'm also on all these boards and groups because I'm trying to shout about the things that I've said to you today. Right whale habitat use is changing. Right whale prey availability impacts their demography and their population size. And so this is a lot of work. And frankly, it is unappreciated. Like, this is not going to help me get tenure. If I tell my colleague that I spent 10 hours with the Marine Mammal Commission this week, they would say, why? But if you have opportunities to do things like this, to join government groups and help them, it helps you. The reason that it helps me is because when I see how they think and how they're using science to guide policy, I realize that we're doing science wrong. If we do science in a very specific way, we can come up with results that are going to be helpful for driving a specific policy forward. And as scientists, we don't expose ourselves to that at all. So if you get opportunities to dabble in management, you know, in the long run, I think it's going to increase the impact that you can make. And thanks to everybody. And I've got some embarrassing pictures of Chuck and Bruce for you. Chuck is a cyclopod, and Bruce is showing off after a satellite remote sensing summer course. Ooh. Any questions?
I have two questions, Erin. That was great. I'm curious. It sounds like your team looks at the acoustic recording to try and detect fails. Is it possible to use AI for that and train a program to have a computer?
Yeah, probably. Right now, I think some machine learning can be used to build these libraries. We haven't used AI yet to automate the, what do we call it, when an analyst reviews a call, pitch track. And it's a little bit of a tricky thing. It probably wouldn't be that hard to develop and implement, but it would be harder to convince managers or vessel users to trust it the same as they would a human analyst. So the boaters, the mariners, and the fishermen that we're working with, they're pretty opinionated. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's an area that's ripe for research and progress. But in terms of implementing it, I would take it very slowly.
Yeah. So that would be a collaboration between computer scientists, but also maybe sociologists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then my other question was, what would it look like to have mandatory slowdowns in that region? Which kind of builds off of this. It sounds like there's lots of opinionated voters and stuff down there. So
there are mandatory slowdowns in a lot of those regions. That seasonal management area picture that I showed and spent like no time talking about, those are mandatory. And the dynamic management is voluntary. And the mandatory slowdowns don't work great. There is some regional variation, but compliance overall is poor. It's really poor in the Southeast US. And so dynamic management, we're trying to see if it's like a psychological tool that can be used. You know, the Southeastern US people don't like that there's essentially 6 months where they have to go 10 knots. But if we could say, well, what about just this week when we heard it will? But a conservation biologist is not going to like that answer. Yeah. So no matter what, you're upsetting somebody.
The mandatory slowdowns are for larger vessels, right? There's still a lot of small vessels that are going fast and they don't have to pay attention.
Yes, that's a really important point. The seasonal management area is effective for vessels 65 feet and greater. There's a proposed rule that's been sitting on NOAA's desk for 2 years now to change that to 35 feet and greater. But the fact that Chevron deference was just overturned a couple months ago probably means that NOAA's not going to push it forward because they don't want to be the ones to get the Supreme Court all riled up on using their new ruling. That kind of dives into the, like, it's worth it to spend time thinking about policy because it turns out there's a lot going on that our scientists are just like, well, there's whales there, so slow down. And then you realize, well, it's a lot of people with a lot of stakes.
Anybody look at what the size of the ship strikes that kill whales? Is it large ships, small ships?
Yeah, my grad student that's not here is working on that, and it's absolutely both. It's absolutely both. Yeah, I don't think we have evidence of a vessel under 35 feet killing a right whale, but smaller, like just in that past 35-foot size range, we have direct evidence of it.
I was wondering, they have that global fish watch thing that
Yeah.
uses the finger.
Yes.
Could they be used to find out people that are violating the slowdown?
Absolutely, or you could just use AIS. Or my collaborator, Catherine, wants to use HF because some boats turn off their AIS. But what do you do? I mean, we already know most people are breaking the rules. So if we say, in fact, that's my grad class, my grad programming class. I make the students find vessels with their names that broke the rules on a certain day.
We have a website of shame.
And that's where that one screenshot was taken from, was a website of shame. Yeah.
So you mentioned, I think you said like 40% of this, I guess, a proponent of the world are now like in
the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
Yeah, Gulf of St. Lawrence. But then like 60% of them are just going somewhere random. Do you know if there's like any correlation between like these boat incidents and potentially like these other whales possibly, of like maybe there's some sort of correlation, like there's a boat incident and then maybe there's some whales that are looking at this new foraging location and this is kind of where it's occurring.
Is that like what you mean? What happened in the Gulf of St. Lawrence when they moved up there and then they got killed by vessel strikes? Is that happening somewhere else?
Yeah, basically, could that give any indication of like maybe this is another potential foraging location?
Yeah, if we were finding bodies somewhere, then that would be the first thing I asked, is what brought them here? Is there good food? And that is a situation that haunts many of my colleagues' dreams, is that there exists some other foraging hotspot where right whales are dying and we don't know about it, and so we're not protecting it. Mm-hmm. It's not a big concern of mine, because if there were a lot of vessels in the area, then we would know, right? Because there would be eyes, and not everybody's going to report it, but somebody's going to. So my theory is that they're more diffusely spread, maybe foraging successfully or maybe just looking for good foraging hotspots.
Why don't we have a break now? 3:15.